Welcome everyone to this presentation on the governance of stratospheric aerosol injection. My name is Ina Möller. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University in the Netherlands and a political scientist by training. And I've conducted research on the politics and governance of climate-altering technologies or geoengineering technologies, including stratospheric aerosol injection for the past 5 years or so. So I'm really happy at this point to provide an introduction to some of the core governance questions associated with stratospheric aerosol injection and to share some of the insights that I've gathered while working on this topic. The aim of this presentation is to introduce you to some of the key political dynamics around the governance of SAI, including the fact that it has many aspects that can be regulated separately, that the wider political context needs to be taken into account, and that there are different narratives or stories that have developed around the need to govern stratospheric aerosol injection. In this sense, the presentation is not meant as a set of recommendations on how to govern SAI or whether we should use it, but rather as a guide on how to conduct informed and reflexive decision-making. To structure this guide, I'll address 3 sub-areas. The first is a general overview about the status of formal regulation that's relevant to stratospheric aerosol injection and the different places that regulation can take place. The second is a short introduction to some key issues surrounding the and the politics of stratospheric aerosol injection, including the interests and the concerns and the political context of actors who could be involved in developing or using this technology. And the third highlights the importance of problem definitions, stories and narratives for shaping more formal types of governance that come later. I hope that reflecting on these 3 sub-areas will provide some helpful tools and perspectives for future conversations on how we should approach decision-making around stratospheric aerosol injection. So bear with me. Let's start with some of the basics. When we talk about stratospheric aerosol injection, we need to remember that this is a technology that's still very much on the drawing board. There's no existing infrastructure for deployment at hand, and most of the activity surrounding it is of scientific and a more speculative nature. So it's useful to separate governance considerations into those that apply to research, which is ongoing, and deployment, which may or may not happen in the future. In terms of research, governance usually happens at national, regional, or organizational level. It's often based on scientific codes of conduct and the judgment of ethical review boards who are responsible for evaluating scientific projects more generally. Some argue that there should be differences in regulation for indoor and outdoor research. Indoor research meaning computer simulations and lab experiments, and outdoor research meaning small-scale testing of devices or observations of how aerosols interact with the natural environment. The separation is mostly made because the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection is quite controversial to many. Not necessarily because the experiments themselves have a particularly intrusive nature or different nature from other scientific experiments. In many cases, it's more a matter of addressing public concerns than avoiding serious environmental harm. In terms of deployment, we usually think of a large-scale intervention that's likely to have effects across borders and that would therefore be subject to international law. Because the technology doesn't really exist yet beyond the scientific drawing board, there's no dedicated instrument for the governance of SAI in particular. However, there are some things that are related to SAI, including its possible use for hostile purposes and some of its potentially negative effects for the environment that are addressed in several international conventions. Recently, there's also been a few instances where the beneficial sides of solar radiation management are being addressed in international arenas. Here we have an overview of the international conventions, agreements, and organizations where issues related to SAI are already addressed or could easily be addressed. If SAI were to use particles that affect the ozone layer, which has been suggested as a possible side effect in existing lab research, this could be regulated by the Montreal Protocol, which governs a list of ozone-depleting substances. If SAI were to use sulfur particles, which is a widely spread idea because it imitates the natural process of volcanic eruptions, this would be governed under the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, which aims to phase out polluting particles that drift across country borders and that includes sulfur as a pollutant. If SAI were to have negative effects on the natural environment, this would be addressed by the Convention on Biological Diversity. The relevant decisions under this convention discourage countries from using so-called geoengineering technologies in the absence of a justifying scientific basis. The decisions aren't binding, but they have a strongly normative component that's relevant for international law and diplomacy. The hostile use of stratospheric aerosol injection is governed under a much less known convention called the Environmental Modification Convention, which was developed after the Vietnam War and the US Army's use of Agent Orange to strip leaves off of trees. It prohibits countries from modifying the environment for military or hostile purposes. On the other hand, a justification for the use of SAI can be found in the Paris Agreement, which includes an ambitious temperature target of limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. If other methods should fail, SAI could be presented as a way of still reaching this temperature target. And finally, very recently, the positive impact on global temperature caused by reflective particles, such as the one used in SAI, will be addressed in a guidance document that's being developed by the International Organization for Standardization. So we'll see what comes out of that. Now that we have an overview of existing regulation, we can move on to questions of politics. If we do think about introducing additional governance mechanisms for SAI, then we first need to reflect on who would be capable of deploying it. As you may have heard before, the costs of deployment are very low in comparison to overall costs of mitigation or adaptation projects worldwide, which is why the technology seems so attractive. It's also why some people are concerned about so-called rogue actors who might start engineering the climate unilaterally. However, I suggest that effective deployment of SAI, meaning over the long term and with a real effect on the climate, is not just a question of technology cost. It also requires long-term dedication, a continuous flow of funding. It requires technical expertise and organizational capacity. This would indicate an actor with military or industrial power. In addition, it requires the acceptance of the international community. Actors who can deploy SAI without encountering pushback from other states need to represent, in the best case, a broad alliance of interests. They would also need a widely accepted justification, and they would need a legal basis for action. This in turn would indicate an actor with widely recognized authority. So most likely, and this is a speculation from my side, effective deployment over the long term will need to be conducted by a coalition of states, backed by an international authority, such as the UN. If SAI were ever to be deployed at large scale, it would require a substantial and comprehensive system of international governance. Yet it's not easy for government actors to engage in the question of how to govern SAI in the first place. When I talk to negotiators and ministry officials in the context of my research, many express hesitation towards engaging with SAI at all. These include widely discussed concerns, such as initiating a slippery slope towards deployment. Also, mitigation deterrence, or so-called moral hazard, the fear that talking about SAI may slow down other, safer ways of responding to climate change, rests on many people's minds. Less widely discussed concerns are also that governments fear damage to their international reputation if they're seen as too openly enthusiastic about the technology. They also express concern about the implications of climate change negotiations more widely if SAI was brought into the discussion. And in addition, there's a widespread insecurity about the scientific status of the technology. Lack of knowledge and the capacity to deal with yet another issue on the already very long agenda is also a hurdle that many countries face. Other actors, by contrast, are more willing to take this issue onto a political agenda. They often argue based on the concern that rogue actors, like the ones I mentioned earlier, might start engineering the climate unilaterally if there are no governance mechanisms in place. In a different vein, questions of national security, conflict, and migration induced by climate change are often underlying motivations for engaging with SAI in the first place. In some countries, international leadership and the perception of competition are additional drivers that fund research. And finally, if a country does want to engage with SAI more substantively, like starting investments in the technology, they do require the legal basis that I mentioned earlier, and therefore have to bring it onto a political agenda. What makes the difference between those countries who are willing to engage and those who aren't? To understand countries' positions on SAI, I suggest that we need to account for their history and for their values. Here are some ideas that I have for guiding our reflections on this. The first dimension is a question of economic priorities. Which parts of the economy are powerful? How much threat does climate change pose to these sectors? And would SAI be a way to save them from damage? But it's not just economic questions that matter. The second dimension is a question of experience with large-scale infrastructure projects. Are countries familiar with the logistics and the management of projects that are somehow comparable? And would they be willing to do something like this at a much larger scale, at the global scale, which would be required for something like SAI? A third dimension concerns environmental values and principles. Is SAI in line with existing values? And would it therefore be accepted by the larger population of that country? Or does it clash substantially and cause enough outrage to engage in political action against it? Both drivers are very strong, and values need to be taken into account here. In the fourth dimension, we can reflect on a country's understanding of its role in the international context. How does it relate to other states? And would it be willing to provide this so-called public good for everyone else? And finally, how much respect does a country have for international diplomacy and for the opinions of other states? And linked to this, of course, how vulnerable is it to potential negative reactions if it were to push for the use of SAI, despite the hesitancy of other states? These are just some ideas to guide us in thinking about the geopolitics of why some states might engage more with SAI and others less. But their exact role and importance remain questions for further research. I now want to move on to the third section of my presentation, which is about problem definitions and their role for guiding governance. This is a really important part of understanding ongoing developments in the governance of SAI. It's not just important for SAI, but for any issue that's discussed in a political context. Essentially, how a problem is defined influences how, when, and where it is governed. Let me demonstrate this to you with two existing examples of problem definitions around SAI that you may already be familiar with. The first example, let's call it problem definition A, starts off by defining climate change as a problem of imbalance in radiative forcing. This means that essentially less of the incoming sunlight that comes into Earth can be let out again because of the increasing layer of greenhouse gases. Stratospheric aerosol injection is then defined as a technology that can help restore that balance long enough so that we can reduce our emissions without experiencing too many negative side effects from climate change. And therefore, governance needs to ensure that any research or deployment is done responsibly and effectively, which would favor an enabling forum that can ensure scientific evaluation and oversight. The second example, let's call it problem definition B, starts off by defining climate change as a problem of excessive growth and consumption, in particular by the richest inhabitants of this planet. Stratospheric aerosol injection is then seen as a technology that artificially prolongs an unsustainable and unjust system, and that runs the risk of hindering an urgently needed transition. Governance, therefore, needs to ensure that this transition towards sustainability is not endangered by SAI, favoring a more restrictive forum for regulating this technology that prioritizes equity and sustainability. Both problem definitions are correct, but they differ in their framing and in their perspective, and therefore in their conclusions. You'll find many more such problem definitions if you start interrogating documents about SAI. The most important thing here is to be aware that different problem definitions exist and that they're often the reason for why people don't agree on what the ideal governance mechanism should be. The role of problem definitions leads me to a piece of research that Arti Gupta and I published in 2019 about the role of authoritative assessments. If problem definitions define how, when, and where we should govern, then authoritative assessments that champion a certain problem definition have an important role in shaping where research and decision-making goes. This is particularly true for reports published by authoritative scientific organizations such as national academies or even the IPCC. Once such an organization publishes a certain problem definition, we call it an intervention in our paper, that can lead other actors to take on the same definition and to shape their scientific activities according to that definition. And this, in turn, informs rules and regulations that are later built for this object of governance. We've called this effect de facto governance because it's not explicit regulation, but it shapes the foundations of decision-making in the long term. It's important to be aware of this dynamic when reflecting on what should be governed and where. And it reminds us to critically reflect on the problem definitions that scientific assessment provides. They may not always be the best or most appropriate ones for a given context. Finally, I want to highlight an interesting piece of research that was recently published in Nature Communications about what we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic for the governance of stratospheric aerosol injection. Holly Buck and colleagues give us a few pointers on what's going wrong with COVID management and what could potentially go wrong with SAI management. We've learned that using narrow metrics like the reproduction number in the case of a pandemic and, well, the temperature in the case of climate change can obscure other important goals. It becomes a matter of managing numbers rather than taking into account things like well-being or equality. We've also learned that there's no global planner. In a situation of crisis, countries tend to rely on themselves, and the authority of international organizations can be questioned. We must thus ask ourselves, how would SAI governance look like if things get really hot? Another thing that we learned is that social media can impact the conduct of science, and not always in a positive way. In a crisis, established peer review systems become less important, while the number of tweets and shares on Facebook can make all the difference. We also saw that politicians tend to prioritize policies that are very visible, even if they're not very effective. Could this be the same for climate change at some point? Could SAI be the visible policy that is hastily introduced without proper knowledge of what it might entail? And finally, we have seen that a focus on stopgap measures risks forgetting the initial goal. Lockdown was introduced as a stopgap measure to scale up testing and contact tracing capacity. This worked in some countries, while others squandered their time that was bought and ended up with a strong resurgence of cases after the lockdown was removed. The same possibility goes for SAI, the stopgap measure, non plus ultra. We have to ask ourselves, will the time bought be spent wisely? Or will we end up in a situation that's worse than before? If we decide to go for SAI, we should definitely use that time very wisely. After raising these important questions, I'd like to end my presentation with some key messages. In order to make informed decisions about governing SAI, we need to acknowledge the role of existing institutions. There is no blank slate for SAI governance. Some concerns are already addressed, or could be, with relatively small changes. And in addition, we need to think about who would maintain authority in a time of crisis, and where SAI governance should subsequently be placed. When thinking about SAI, we should also contextualize it in a wider political context. Norms and interests and expectations play an important role in determining different actors' positions. They're the basis for cooperation and conflict. And we should acknowledge both the role of material and of normative power in determining who might be able to deploy SAI. We should remember that in times of crisis, other dynamics than scientific rationality may become important drivers of action. And finally, we need to recognize the power of narrative. There is no really neutral account of SAI. All narratives are political because they need to work with problem definitions that prioritize one perspective over another. We can therefore critically reflect on dominant problem definitions and ask whether the ones we work with are the ones best suited to the task at hand. And finally, we should always ask whose interests are represented by a certain problem definition and whose perspectives are missing. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and point out a few resources for further reading. If you're interested in the regulatory and legal landscape of SAI governance, please have a look at Karen Brenn's excellent thesis on this subject. If you'd like to know more about the politics of crisis, then I can direct you to Holly Buck et al.'s piece in Nature Communications, which is open access. I've also added 3 articles which contain some of my own research, in which many of the messages in this presentation are reflected. This is, of course, only a tiny selection of the burgeoning literature on SAI governance that is available. And for further pointers, please feel free to get in contact with myself or with the organizers of this session. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.